He was waiting for her on the other side of the door. She knew he would be, not because he cared about the creature she carried, but because she had disobeyed a sealed order. The Alpha King did not suffer disobedience. The air in the corridor was cold, a living thing that clung to the stone and sought the warmth of her skin. It was a pre-dawn, cold, thin, and sharp as a shard of glass. Alara held the bundle tighter against her chest, feeling the impossibly fragile flutter of life within the swaddling claws. They had told him there was nothing to save. The royal veterinarians, the high priest, his own grim-faced council, though it all pronounced the litter lost. A curse on the bloodline, and had ordered the birthing chamber of the great Lycase sealed until mourning rites could be performed. A sterile, hopeless verdict. She had heard the finality and the turning of the key, the heavy grate of the bolt sliding home. She had already gone in anyway now. She faced him. Lord Valerius stood as if carved from the same granite as his castle walls, a study in absolute stillness. He was not a large man, not in the way of brutes and warriors, but his presence consumed the space around him, pulling the light and the air and the silence toward himself. His black tunic was unadorned, his dark hair unkempt from a sleepless night, but the authority was in his posture, in the unblinking focus of his gaze. It was a gaze that did not ask. It assessed, judged, and dismissed. He looked at the sealed door, its wax sigil broken by her entry. Then his eyes fell to her. They were the color of a winter storm, gray and deep and holding the promise of ruin. He did not look at the bundle in her arms. To acknowledge it would be to acknowledge her defiance as something other than a simple transgression. "You are ordered to remain in the kitchen," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was a low baritone that resonated in the stone, a sound that carried its own weight and needed no volume for emphasis. It was the voice of a man who had not been questioned in a decade. Alara met his gaze. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, but she held her body still, mimicking his control. She had learned long ago that to show fear was to give it as a weapon to those who would use it against you. The she-wolf was crying. "My lord," she answered. Her own voice was steady, betraying none of the tremor she felt in her hands. They left her to die alone, a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or a deeper, colder anger, passed through his eyes. They left her to die with dignity. "You disturbed a sacred morn." "There is no dignity in a cold stone floor," she said, the words out before she could stop them. Her sharpness was a reflex, a shield she raised whenever threatened. She clutched the bundle, a sudden, fierce protectiveness washing over her. She had spent hours in the dark, in the stench of death and birthing blood, coaxing this single, impossible spark into a flame. She would not let him snuff it out with a word. Finally, his eyes dropped to what she held. For the first time, his composure seemed to fray at the edges, a minute tightening of his jaw. The bundle shifted, and a tiny milk-white snout poked out from the cloths, followed by a weak, mewling sound that was swallowed by the vast, cold silence of the hall. The pup was impossibly small, its fur the color of bone, its eyes sealed shut. It was the runt of a lost litter, a creature that had no right to be breathing. When Valerius stated it was not a question, it was a fact, reluctantly acknowledged. The seers foretold a litter of 7, an omen of prosperity. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. One is not prosperity. It is a mockery of it. "It is a lonker," Alara countered, her voice dropping to a whisper, i.e. is not read in numbers, but in brack. He took a step toward her, and she instinctively took one back, her shoulders hitting the cold, unyielding wood of the sealed door. He stopped, his gaze forensic. Dissecting her, he saw the smudges of dirt on her cheek, the strands of dark hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, the raw, chapped skin of her hands. He saw a servant who had overstepped a girl who smelled of straw and iron and something else. a metallic tang of afterbirth. He did not see a savior, he saw a complication, the soft scrape of a boot on stone as he ships his weight. Lord Cassian, Valerius said, his voice returning to its flat, commanding tone without turning his head. From the shadows at the far end of the hall, a man detached himself from the gloom. Lord Cassian was the Kingerhand, a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose robes were always immaculate. He moved with a silent grace that was more menacing than any soldier's stomp. His gaze slid over Alara with a polite disinterest that was 1,000 times more insulting than the Kinger open displeasure. "My lord," Cassian murmured, his eyes lingering on the white puppon. An unexpected development, the veterinarians were cert. His gaze still locked on Alara. They swore the entire litter was lost, hours before the breach. Perhaps their certainty was Primor. Cassian suggested, his tones smooth as oil. He looked at Alara, a hint of something calculating in his expression. Or perhaps there are other forces at work. Such a creature, born against all odds. It is the stuff of folklore, of hedge magic. The accusation hung in the air, venomous and deliberate. Alara felt a chill colder than the stone at her back. Witchcraft. The word was a death sentence. She saw the trap coiling around her. She had done the impossible. And in a world governed by rigid prophecy and ironclad law, the impossible was another word for heresy. Valerius did not react. His stillness was absolute. He was watching her. He wanted to see if she would crumble, if she would plead or weep. He wanted to see the shape of her fear. She did neither. She lifted her chin, her grip on the living pup the only anchor in a world tilting on its axis. "I used warm water and a soft cloth, my lord," she said, her voice clear and cold. "If that is magic, then every mother in this kingdom is a witch." For a long, stretched moment, there was only the sound of the pup in faint whimpers. Valerius' eyes held hers, and she felt as if he were reading the secret history of every scar on her soul. He was a man who lived in a fortress of his own making, and she had just thrown a stone at its highest wall. She did not know if he would ignore it, or if he would tear down the gate and crush her for her insolence. The silence stretched, becoming a battlefield. Then he gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a decision made in the space of a single heartbeat. "Take it," he said. The command directed past her toward the armed guards who stood like statues down the hall. But his eyes never left hers. "Take them both to the west wing. Put her in the chamber adjoining my own." Cassian carefully neutral expression tightened. "By Lord, a kitchen servant in the royal wing." "She claims responsibility for this," Omen Valerius said, finally tearing his gaze from her to look at the white pup. His voice was laced with something that sounded almost like contempt, but it was aimed at the situation, at fate itself, not at her. "Then she will bear the burden of its survival, under my direct supervision." He looked back at Alara, and the full crushing weight of his power settled over her. "If it dies," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout, "Ed, I will not be so lenient a second time." A long waited silence. The guards moved then, their armor clinking in the quiet hall, their hands reaching not for her but to flank her, to escort her. She was not a prisoner, not yet. She was something far more precarious. She was the Kinghorn problem, and he had just decided to keep his problem very, very close. The chamber was an opulent cage. It was larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in, with a ceiling so high it seemed to gather its own shadows. A fire had been lit in the hearth, its flames consuming logs of silver birch that hissed and popped, casting a restless golden light over the tapestries that lined the walls. They depicted ancient hunts, Kings and their like-felling mythical beasts in every woven scene. The wolves were immense, powerful creatures of silver and gray and black. There were no small, bone-white runts among them. A bed, draped in velvet, the color of dried blood, sat in the center of the room like a sacrificial altar. She ignored it. Her world had shrunk to the size of the hearthrug, where she knelt beside a small makeshift nest of fleece and her own worn cloak. The pup, which she had started calling Ghost in the privacy of her own mind, was not doing well. Its breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the quiet room. Its tiny body was too cool to the touch. The court physician, a portly man with nervous hands, had come and gone, leaving behind a bowl of fortified goat milk, which the pup refused to take. He had pursed his lips and declared it a matter for the gods. It was a coward excuse, and Alara knew it for what it was, a refusal to be associated with a potential failure. A failure the king was now watching with an unnerving intensity. Valerius was there. He had not left her alone for more than a few minutes at a time. He did not sit, but stood near the mullioned window, a silhouette against the bruised purple of the encroaching twilight. He had said nothing to her since the guards had deposited her here hours ago. He simply existed in the space, a silent, brooding sentinel. His presence was a constant pressure against her skin. She was acutely aware of every breath he took, every slight shift of his weight, every time his gaze swept over her and the fading life in her care. She felt less like a person and more like an experiment he was observing, waiting to see the outcome. She tried to block him out to focus on the small, desperate life before her. She dipped her finger in the milk and touched it to the pup-burned lips. He turned his head away with a weak whine. Her own exhaustion was a heavy cloak, but panic was a sharper, more insistent thing. She could not let it die, not now. Not with him watching. Its death would be her failure, her sentence. It would prove Cassian right. She closed her eyes, forcing the image of the physician useless remedies from her mind and searching for older knowledge for the things her grandmother had taught her. Whispers of herbs, of poultices, of the quiet magic of the earth. She needed fennel for the belly, a touch of honey for strength and warmth, a constant, steady warmth. It needs a mother he, she said, the words slipping out, quiet and rough. She had meant to speak to him, but the silence was suffocating her. From the window, his voice came back, devoid of emotion. "Its mother is dead?" "I know," she snapped, her frustration making her reckless. She looked up, meeting his shadowed form. "I was the one who held her head as she bled out on your cold stone floor. I know she is dead." She expected anger, a swift and terrible rebuke for her tone. Instead, he was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. "Quieter, the birthing fever is a plague. It has taken the last 3 royal litters. We have tried everything." "You have tried Thizint's," she countered, her voice low and fierce. "You have not tried listening." She turned back to the pup, her resolve hardening. She would not let this place, this man, this fear be the end of it. She unlaced the collar of her simple woolen dress, pulling the fabric wide, ignoring the king, ignoring the impropriety that would have had her flogged on any other day. She carefully lifted the pup from its nest. She tucked it against the bare skin of her chest, swaddling it in her own clothes, pulling her cloak tight around them both. She lay down on the rug before the fire, curling her body around the tiny creature, trying to lend it her own life, her own heat. The soft cackle of the fire. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, her body aching, her mind adrift on a sea of fatigue. The only sounds were the fire and the pup-in fragile breathing, which seemed to be growing steadier against her skin. She did not know when she drifted off, but when she awoke, it was to a profound sense of being watched. She opened her eyes. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. casting the room in a deep, velvet darkness, and he was there. He was no longer by the window. He was kneeling on the other side of the hearth, no more than an army length away. His knees were on the cold stone. His posture still impossibly straight, but he was there, on her level. He had moved from his position of power to a place of shared vigil. In the dim red glow of the coals, she could see his face more clearly than she had all day. The harsh lines of duty and command were softened by shadow. He looked younger than she had thought, and he looked tired. There were faint dark circles beneath his eyes, a tension in his mouth that spoke of a burden carried for too long. His gaze was fixed on the small space where the pup was nestled against her. "Its breathing is strong," he said. It was a simple observation, a statement of fact, but in the charged stillness of the room, it felt like a concession. An admission that her way, the servant way, had achieved what his royal physicians could not. He needed warmth, she whispered, her throat dry. "Abba, sometimes the simplest things are the only things that matter." He did not reply. He simply continued to watch. She felt a strange, unwilling intimacy in the moment. Here in the dark, they were not king and servant. They were just two people, holding vigil over a fragile new life in a world that had already given up on it. He had been alone inside his own silence for so long, she realized. He was surrounded by people, guards, councilmen, sycophants, but he was utterly alone. She wondered if he knew what it sounded like to be in a room with someone who did not want something from him. All she wanted was for this pup to live. And in that moment, she sensed that he, for the first time, wanted the same thing. He was not saved by her, he was witnessed by her, and she could feel with the certainty that frightened her that he knew it. That was worse. The days that followed fell into a strange, hushed rhythm, dictated by the needs of the small creature that lived against her skin. Alara rarely left the chamber. Meals appeared on a tray outside the door, left by silent servants, who scurried away before she could see their faces. Her world was the warmth of the fire, the scent of milk and clean linen, and the constant, unnerving proximity of the king. He was a creature of habit and immense self-control. He would spend hours at the large oak desk in the corner of the room, reading reports and signing decrees, the scratch of his quill a persistent, rhythmic sound. But she always felt his attention was only half on his papers. The other half was on her, on Ghost. The pup was growing stronger. He had finally begun to take milk from a dropper, and his bone-white fur was becoming thick and soft. His eyes, when they opened, were a startling pale blue, the color of a winter sky reflected in ice. He was a creature of impossible delicacy, and yet he possessed a fierce will to live that Alara found herself fiercely admiring. Tending to him was an anchor. It gave her a purpose in this gilded prison, a reason to ignore the weight of the Kingang's silent scrutiny. Sometimes she would catch him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. She would be humming a low tune to lull the pup to sleep, a half-forgotten melody from her childhood, and would look up to find his quill stilled, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He would look away immediately, his expression closing down, becoming once more the remote and unreadable monarch. But the moment had happened. It was a crack in the ice, a glimpse of the man beneath the crown. She began to learn him in the way one learns a landscape, not by asking questions, but by observing the subtle shifts in light and shadow. She learned the specific tension in his shoulders that meant Lord Cassian had delivered bad news. She learned the way his hand would clench into a fist on his desk when a report displeased him. She learned that late at night, when the castle was asleep, he would sometimes stand by the window for an hour or more, looking out at the dark sleeping lands over which he ruled, his solitude so profound it was like a physical presence in the room. One afternoon, while cleaning a small spill of milk from the floor, her fingers idly traced a pattern in the dust beneath a heavy side table. It was a habit, a nervous gesture she had had since she was a child, a small, interlocking spiral, like a coiled vine. She did it without thinking, a way to occupy her hands, to ground herself when her thoughts became too loud. She finished her task, picked up the pup, and thought no more of it. The next morning, a heavy frost had bloomed across the leaded glass of the window panes, and there, etched into the delicate white lace of the ice, was the same pattern. A perfect interlocking spiral. It was small, in a corner of the pane, almost hidden, but it was there. A sharp, indrawn breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He had seen her. He had watched her mindless private gesture, and he had copied it. It was not a word. It was not a look. It was something else entirely. A silent, secret acknowledgement. A message. She felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, a mix of fear and a strange, terrifying elation. This was dangerous, this quiet observation, this silent mirroring. It was more intimate than any conversation, more perilous than any command. It was a thread spun between them in the stillness, and she did not know if it was a lifeline or a noose. She began to see it elsewhere. A faint tracing on the condensation of a silver water pitcher, the subtle arrangement of spent embers in the hearth. He never did it when she was looking. It was always a discovery she made later, a sign that he had been there, that he had been seeing her in a way she was sure no one else ever had. The gesture became their unspoken dialogue. Her life had been one of invisibility. As a servant, she was meant to be overlooked, a ghost in the halls long before she'd named the pup. But he did not overlook her. He saw everything. The more the pup thrived, the more the atmosphere in the castle curdled. Alara could feel it when she was occasionally permitted to walk ghost in the cloister gardens. The guards watched her with suspicion. The few courtiers she passed would fall silent, their eyes following her with a mixture of awe and malice. She was the wolf, the kitchen servant who had somehow ensnared the kinger attention. More Cassian, the iron poison was working its way through the veins of the court. He was always polite to her face, his words like polished stones, but his eyes held a chilling satisfaction. He was building a narrative, and she was the villain at its center. One evening, the pup began to whine. He refused his milk again, turning his head away, his small body trembling. A fever. Alara in blood ran cold. She bathed him in cool water. She tried to force a few drops of liquid between his lips, but the fever climbed. He grew listless, his breaths coming in ragged pants. She worked through the night, her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Every remedy she knew she tried. Nothing worked. Just before dawn, the door to the chamber opened. Valerius entered. He had clearly been roused from sleep. He wore only dark trousers and a loose linen shirt, his feet bare on the cold stone. He said nothing, but came to kneel beside her on the hearthrug. His eyes were on the shivering pup, his face grim. "It is the fee," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and despair. "I don't know what else to do." He reached out, not to the pup, but to her. His fingers brushed against her forehead, pushing a stray, damp strand of hair from her eyes. His touch was unexpectedly gentle, his skin cool. It was the first time he had touched her. The contact was like a bolt of lightning, a shocking, searing connection in the dim room. The sound of a shuddering breath, her own, "You have not slept," he stated, his hand falling away. "And neither have you," she countered, nodding toward the dark circles under his eyes, more pronounced than ever. He looked at the small, trembling creature between them. "My sis," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it, "she died of a fever like this. The physicians, they did the same. They offered potions and prayers. They stood back and let it consume her." He paused, and in that silence she heard the echo of a boy in grief, a wound that had never properly healed. They called it the will of the gods then, too. In that moment he was not her king. He was a man haunted by a memory, a man who understood the unique agony of helplessness. Her own private wound, the loss of her family to a plague that had swept through her village years ago, ached in sympathy. She knew that feeling of watching a life slip away while those in power offered empty words. "Help me," she whispered, the request torn from her. It was a plea, an admission, that she could not do this alone. He did not hesitate. "Tell me what you need." For the next hour, they worked together. He held the pup, his large, steady hands surprisingly gentle, murmuring low, soothing words as Alara crushed herbs with a pestle she demanded from the kitchens. She made a poultice of yarrow and willow bark, a bitter-smelling concoction that she spread on a soft cloth. She laid it on the puppern chest, and Valerius held it in place. They moved in a seamless, unspoken rhythm, a partnership born of shared desperation. They were two solitary people, fighting for one small, fragile life against the encroaching darkness. As the first pale rays of dawn crept through the window, the puprin trembling began to subside, his breathing eased, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. The fever had broken. Ilara sagged with relief, the tension draining out of her so completely she felt she might collapse. She looked at Valerius. His face, illuminated by the dawn, was unguarded. The mask of the king was gone, and in its place was a profound, weary relief. His eyes met hers over the sleeping pup, and the world seemed to fall away. There was no castle, no court. There was only this room, this fire, this silence. He had not saved the pup. She had not saved it. They had. And in that shared victory, something irreversible had passed between them. A line had been crossed. They had not been approaching it. They had been on the other side of it for days, and were only just now realizing it. The air was thick with everything they could not say, with a truth that was both a comfort and a terrifying new danger. The fragile peace was shattered the following day. Lord Cassian requested an audience with the king and his council, a matter of grave importance concerning the security of the throne and the sanctity of the royal bloodline. Valerius had to go. He left Alara with a single, weighted look, a silent warning to be careful. The door had barely closed behind him before two of Cassian's personal guards entered her chamber. They were not the kingy men. These guards moved with a coiled serpentine grace, their eyes cold and empty. "Lord Cassian requires your press," the first one said. It was not a request. They led her not to the council chamber, but to a small, windowless antechamber nearby. Cassian was waiting for her, standing beside a small table. He smiled his thin, bloodless smile. "A percall," he said smoothly. "The king is protective of you. It is best we speak plainly, without his judgment being clouded by sentiment." On the table was a small leather pouch, the one she used to carry the few herbs she had been allowed for the pup. Cassian reached out and slowly, deliberately untied the drawstring. He tipped it over, and its contents spilled across the dark wood. Dried fennel seeds, chamomile flowers, a few strips of willow bark, and a sprig of glossy green leaves with small purple-black berries. Nightshade. Alara stared at it, her blood turning to ice. She had never seen it before in her life. It was a poison, a potent one. An herb known to induce the very symptoms of fever and delirium from which Ghost had just recovered. It was the perfect, damning piece of evidence, planted. "This was found among your thing," Cassian said, his voice a silken caress. "It is a curious remedy for a sick animal. More curious still that the pupper illness so closely mirrors the effects of this very herb. One might almost think—" He paused, picking up the sprig between his thumb and forefinger. "That the sickness was induced. A performance, perhaps. A way to indebt the king to you further, to prove your unique talents." "I have never seen that before," she said, her voice a strangled whisper. The trap was sprung. It was elegant in its cruelty, simple and irrefutable. Per word against his, the word of a kitchen servant? Against the Kinger hand? Of course you haven't, Cassian murmured, his eyes glittering. You are merely a simple girl who happened to save a sacred life. But others will see a different story. They will see an ambitious witch who enchanted a pup to enchant a king. The law is very clear on such matters, and Lord Valerius, for all his recent distraction, is a man of law. He was right. She could see the entire path laid out before her. The accusation, the trial, the verdict, Valerius would be forced to choose. He could defend her, the nameless serving girl, and in doing so defy his counsel, his law, and the traditions that held his kingdom together. It would be seen as weakness, as proof that she had bewitched him. He would risk civil unrest, perhaps even open rebellion from factions loyal to Cassian, or he could sacrifice her, a single insignificant life, to maintain order and the stability of his reign. It was not a choice at all. It was a political calculation, and she was on the wrong side of the equation. The guards escorted her back to her chamber and stood sentinel outside the door. She was a prisoner now, in fact as well as in name. She sat on the hearthrug, pulling the sleeping ghost into her lap, stroking his soft, white fur. She did not weep. Her fear was too cold, too deep, for tears. She simply waited. She waited for the sound of the council adjourning. She waited for the heavy tread of the Kinger boots in the hall. She waited for the verdict that she already knew had been decided. Hours later, the door opened. It was him. He stood on the threshold, his face a mask of stone. The audience with his counsel was over. He was once again the Alpha King. Encased in iron and duty, he walked into the room, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click. A door closing softly, he did not look at her immediately. He walked to the table where a tray with the day untouched meals sat. He poured a goblet of water and drank it down in one long draught. His movements were deliberate, controlled, but she could see the rigid line of his back, the coiled tension in his frame. The storm that was raging outside this room in the heart of his castle was raging inside of him. Finally, he turned to face her. He walked to the center of the room, stopping a few feet away. His gray eyes were dark, unreadable. The silence stretched thick and heavy with everything that had happened, with everything that was about to. This was it. The moment of his choice. He would tell her he was sorry. He would tell her the law was the law. He would tell her that his hands were tied. He would sacrifice her. He had to. She braced herself for the words. He held out his hand. In his palm lay the sprig of nightshade. He had it. Cassian had given him the evidence, the weapon, the justification. Lord Cassian presented this to the Count, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. He claims it was found in your possession. He claims you have been poisoning the pup to manipulate me. Alara looked from the poison in his hand to the cold mask of his face. She did not deny it. She did not defend her anymore. What was the point? The truth did not matter anymore. Only power mattered. She simply met his gaze and held it. Her silence, her only remaining shield. She would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. He held her gaze for a long, torturous moment. She saw a flicker of something in the depths of his eyes. A conflict, a war being fought in the silence. He was not just a king making a ruling. He was a man facing an impossible choice. And she was the one who had forced it upon him. He had been witnessed by her, and now he had to decide if that witness was worth more than his kingdom. He lowered his gaze to the poison in his hand, then looked back at her, his expression clearing, settling into a terrifying absolute certainty. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a speech. He simply looked at her, at the woman who had disobeyed him, challenged him, and shown him a flicker of life in the ashes of his world. This, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the force of a landslide, "It is not yours." He closed his hand, crushing the leaves and berries into a dark stain against his skin. He turned, without another word, and strode to the door. He did not look back. He pulled the heavy door open, and the angry raised voices from the council chamber spilled into the room for a brief moment before he stepped out, pulling it shut behind him. The distant, muffled sound of an argument, abruptly cut off by a closing door, she was left alone in the sudden, ringing silence. He had not absolved her. He had not declared her innocent. He had made a choice. He had not saved her from them. He had chosen her and was now standing against them. She heard his voice from the corridor, no longer quiet, but cold and sharp as steel, cutting through the dissent of the other men. He was not defending her. He was giving orders. She slid to the floor, her legs no longer able to support her. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She had thought she was approaching a line. She had not realized that he had already crossed it for both of them and set the world on fire as he did. It was long after midnight when he returned. The castle had fallen into a tense, watchful silence, the kind that follows a battle when no one is yet sure who has won. Alara had not moved from the hearth. She had built the fire up, and she sat with Ghost curled in her lap, the rhythmic rise and fall of his sleeping form the only steady thing in a world that had come unmoored. She heard his footsteps in the hall, slow and heavy. The sound of a man who had spent the last several hours dismantling his own kingdom to protect one small part of it. The door opened and he entered, closing it gently behind him. He looked diminished, not in stature, but in spirit. The iron shell of the king was gone. Stripped away by the Daeurn conflict, he was just Valerius. He wore the same clothes, but they seemed to hang on him differently. He walked to the fire and stood over her, his shadow long and distorted on the wall behind him. He looked down at her, at the pup, and the weariness on his face was so profound it was a physical ache in her own chest. He had paid a price for his choice. She could see it in the new lines etched around his eyes. Cassian has been relieved of his dues, he said, his voice rough, as if he had been shouting for hours. He will be confined to his estates. There are others on the council who share his concerns. They will not be an issue again. He had won. He had faced down the subtle treason of his most trusted advisor and broken it. For her, a kitchen servant, the imbalance of it was dizzying. You risked every, she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was no risk, he answered, and for the first time he knelt down in front of her, not as a king, not as a watcher, but as an equal. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the faint, dark stain of the crushed nightshade still on his palm. There was only a choice between the world as it was and the world as it might be. He reached out his hand, hesitating for a moment before he rested it on the pupper's sleeping head. His touch was incredibly gentle. Ghost stirred, leaning into the touch with a soft sigh. He is a Fian, Valerius murmured, a hint of wonder in his voice. He had to be, Alaris said, looking at the man before her. The dangerous still water had finally been disturbed, and she was seeing what lay beneath. Not a monster, not just a king, but a man who had been starving for something true in a court full of lies. He looked from the pup to her, and his gray eyes held a new light, something deeper and more vulnerable than she had ever seen. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was not the silence of caution or observation. It was the silence of arrival, a place of rest after a long, brutal journey. It was the most intimate act she had ever known. He will need a stronger name than Ghosts, Valerius said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her. A name for a creature that was never meant to be, but is. It was not a question. It was a statement, a shared future, spoken into existence in the quiet of the night. It was not a triumphant declaration. It was not a soft romance. It was something harder, something forged in defiance and shadow. It was the world exhaling. And in the stillness, surrounded by the embers of the life he had nearly lost and the life she had saved, Alara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was not an ending. It was the beginning.